Kathy, thanks for the prayers as well. It's great to be with you guys. My name is Blake. I can see a few fresh faces. Welcome to church if you're new. I'm one of the pastors here at Bondi Anglican Church, and I'm really glad to take us into week 2 of our new series in Genesis, that first book of the Bible, life by faith. And that's because they're way back 3,000 or so years ago with, I'm going to call them Abraham and Sarah. That's not yet their name, but it will be. They set up, well, they don't set up, actually God sets up a pattern with them of relating that becomes the paradigm, not just for them and all their descendants, the Jewish nation, Israel, but also for all people of the New Testament and for us who are Christians as well. What we see here becomes the paradigm for all of us in relating to God. Not necessarily the same content, but the same structure of faith. Life is done for Christians by faith. Life is done for Abraham and Sarah by faith, and for us by faith. It's not done by power. You might be a powerful person who can get things done if you put your mind or your muscles or both of them to it. That's great for you. In some ways, I'm sure it's great. But that's actually just not how you approach the Christian life, with kind of lots of willpower and I'm just going to make the next 2 years, I'll just put my nose down and I'm going to make this happen. That's actually not the flavor, the paradigm of the Christian faith. Secondly, it's not the case that faith is done by credit or merit. Again, you might be someone who has a lot of merits about you. I meet lots of people in Bondi who are they seem great, so really competent people. And that might take you places elsewhere. It won't take you places in the Christian faith, because that's just the wrong paradigm. That's not what God sets up as the paradigm for life with you. Equally, though, you might be someone who doesn't have much merit to your name and isn't very competent in the world's eyes. But this is good news for you because, again, it's just not the category that God works with people by credit. He works with people by faith. And this is good news. It's also not the case that the Christian faith is done by pride and how you feel about things. I feel pretty good about God. But then again, I'm a pretty positive person. I feel good about most things. Again, you might not feel very good about the world, yourself, and God. But that's a little bit of irrelevant, interesting personality thing, but actually irrelevant because Christian faith is not done by how I feel or what God seems like in a vague sense of God, but by faith in Him, the person. And here in Genesis 12 to 22, which is where we'll be to Christmas, we're learning how to live moment by faith. Lots of lessons as we see God and Abraham and Sarah interacting, and we pick up what it is to live by faith. And last week we were at the start of Genesis chapter 12, where God calls Abraham and Sarah to Himself and says, I want you to go from your country and from your people, and I want you to go to a place that I'll show you. It doesn't name it. He just says, go to a place that I'll show you soon. We're already learning about faith at that point. But with that command, He gives a promise. I'm going to make you into a great nation, and I will make your name great. And thirdly, I'll give great blessing to you and through you, so that other nations, actually all the nations of the world, will be blessed through your new nation I'm making you. And do you remember also He says, and I will curse those who curse you. So special, so treasured are they as His people, picked out, that if you curse these people, God will curse you back. And that's where it started. And then there's some really interesting little verses in between last week and this week that I'm not going to touch on. Have a look for yourself. And then we come to verse 10, and it says this. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. And already in this first verse of our passage here, verse 10, we're learning something of faith, which is the great big command and promise to Abraham has been given. And that doesn't hold off famine for them. Very soon, after the great big promise, they're in a famine. And in such a famine, they actually have to move house. Can you imagine if Australia was hit by the kind of drought or famine that meant you had to move locations because there just wasn't enough food here anymore? It's that kind of trial. That would be so uprooting, wouldn't it? It'd be terrible. And that's what's happening with Abraham and Sarah. And I want you to see that God has mountainous, big, good things for Abraham and Sarah and for you in Jesus. The promises he makes, they're mountainously good. And sometimes there'll be famines as well. Because Abraham and Sarah are on a physical journey going to a place where God's going to establish the things that he promised. And you too are on a journey, maybe not location geographic, but you are on a journey going somewhere and you're not there yet. There is a mountain of goodness ahead of you, but it's not all here yet. Well, you're not there actually yet. And sometimes there'll be famines on the way. And it calls for a kind of faith, not power, maybe going and stealing food or just planning really, really well to make sure that you've got food even though nobody else does. Not just kind of vibing it and seeing how you go, or not working on your credit, although that might help here and there, but walking by faith in famines, which you will have. And it's so interesting what happens. Verse 11, okay. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, I know that you are beautiful. I know what a beautiful woman you are. How lovely is that? It's a really nice turn in the story. They're just about to enter Egypt across the border, and he says a really wise thing. He tells his wife that she's beautiful. Yeah, that's really nice, isn't it? But actually, it's not very nice because this is not him complimenting his wife for her sake, which is how compliments ought to work, right? It's all about to turn a little sour because he's got a great fear. Listen, as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, I know what a beautiful woman you are. Sure, just like that. When the Egyptians see you, they'll say, this is his wife. Then they'll kill me, but they will let live. Abraham doesn't just think that his wife's beautiful, he thinks that she's too beautiful. And as we said, we'll learn in chapter 17 of Genesis that she's 65. And you kind of think, maybe when you were younger, Abraham, maybe when she was younger, maybe you could have been, should have been worried about what would happen when you moved to a new country and they might try and steal your wife. But it sounds like he's overthinking it, doesn't it? Interestingly, he's not. They will notice just how beautiful she is. She had extraordinary beauty. And the Egyptians will notice it. So he's right to think about this and notice it. But it's what he does next. He doesn't just notice it and go, this is a concern. He makes a plan and tells her that she's going to need to lie in order to protect him, and goes on to at verse 14. When Abraham came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarah was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. I find that a really just a sad little end to the sentence. She was taken into his palace. He treated Abraham well for her sake, and Abraham provided sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. I guess it's some kind of dowry paid to Abraham. And it's really very sad. He's quite literally sold his wife out to Pharaoh for his own safety. But secondly, it's quite dire because not only has he sold his wife out, he's sold out on God. Because this action relates directly to what God has just said. Or actually, it's kind of the opposite. It relates opposite. There's a word for that, isn't it? Someone will tell me after it relates in the opposite fashion to what has just been promised. Because God just promised Abraham and Sarah, I will make you into a great nation. That can't happen if Abraham and Sarah are separate. And that can't happen if Abraham is killed. And so Abraham wasn't going to be killed. They may have noticed that his wife was very beautiful. They may have done and said all sorts of things. But God has promised what was going to happen, but Abraham is not trusting that. He's gotten up that morning, and the world he sees is not a world where God is in control and does what he says. The world is a place where Abraham needs to take control of things with his power and sort things out and make sure that it's safe for him, even at cost to his beautiful wife. And I don't think he's even thinking about God at this point as a player in the world, but God is a player in the world. Another really interesting thing here is that Sarah actually is his half-sister. A bit weird. 3,000 years ago, they were still working things out. It's a little strange, but I find it very interesting because it's obvious that God will judge what has happened. It's not right. And yet there's a half truth to it. And so often in our own ways of failures and our own sin, there's half truths that we base our decisions on. And it's something to watch out for, the half truth. Similar to the half truth in the Garden of Eden, we didn't look at recently, but there, isn't it? And the prophet Jeremiah, later in the Old Testament, in chapter 2 of Jeremiah, has this just cutting little illustration that's speaking from God now, writing on God's behalf, and he captures this kind of sin, and I think the anatomy of all sin. And when he captures the anatomy of all sin, when Jeremiah in chapter 2, verse 3 says, my people have committed two sins. Might look like one, but he says, my people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water. And they've dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. It's talking about the anatomy of sin that I think you see in Abraham's life, which is there's two things going on, two terrible things. First of all, I'll take them backwards. He sold out his wife and put her in a really, not just a dangerous, but like abusive situation. Just really, palming her out so that he will be safe and he gets all this money and dowry. And that is a sin against her and against his own marriage. And it cannot hold water, Jeremiah would say. That kind of safety won't last. I'm pretty sure bet that Pharaoh is a ruthless person, and I reckon he would probably get sick of women pretty quickly and sick of women's husbands pretty quickly, and it's just not a safe place for them. It's not going to last for very long. And it's certainly not going to get them the kind of great name that has been promised to them, that is a gift from God. And it's not going to turn them into, it's definitely not going to turn them into a great nation. They definitely won't have children now. And they can't be a blessing. She's in a terrible situation. He's not been a blessing because he's got new camels. That's the first sin. Cisterns, dug out wells that can't actually hold water because they're broken. But the second sin, or actually the first sin, is that they've forsaken God, the spring of living waters, because God does have good for them, and he does have life for them, and they've committed two sins. Or to use the phrases from Proverbs that Kathy read, Proverbs 29 says, the fear of people will prove to be a trap. Revering what people say about you and think about you and do about you and how they act toward you is a trap. Giving it lots of attention and trying to change what they think of you and how they relate to you, Proverbs says that's a trap. It'll snap close. And then secondly, it says, but whoever trusts in the Lord is kept safe. See the picture here? It's a negative example, isn't it? That his faith is failing. He's just forgotten that God has promised him something, and he's taken things into his own hands. I was Abraham's pastor. I would grab him, and I would want to say to him, go back and get your wife, and you look after her properly. But actually, we're not only into morals here. We do care about how we treat each other, how I treat them, how you treat them. But I'd say, go back. And actually, it probably wouldn't work if I just told him to go back and get his wife, because he's scared. I need to empower him. And I'd point out to him and I'd say, God has promised you something, and you can trust this God. And if he said that he's going to make your name great, he said that you're going to have a nation, no matter how darn good looking your wife is, you're going to be safe. That's what I think. But it's a little different for us because we have different promises. They're set upon this set of promises for Abraham, our promises. Really interesting and difficult to try and relate. How do the promises that you have, the very specific, particular promises you have, how do they sit on top of, but are not exactly the same promises about a nation belonging to Abraham? Point is, you have the same paradigm, which is faith in the things that God has told you, even though I don't believe that you ought to expect that God will necessarily curse people that curse you this afternoon, or that he's going to turn you into a great new nation called whatever your name is. And yet we have the same, as I said, same structure, paradigm of faith, and our promises do sit on top of and come straight out of it. What I'm trying to get at here is what you need to hear from me, or actually what you need to hear from yourself and do business with God, is working out what are the promises of God to you that will dictate and hold for you space tomorrow when you find yourself in front of a Pharaoh, or when you find yourself in fear in the office or in your home, when you find yourself considering the thoughts of other people about you, considering the actions of other people about you. What are the promises you need to stand on in order to relate to those people, to those things, to those challenges, by faith and not by sight? And one of the hopes I have for us in this series is that as we talk about living by faith, we always keep on asking, faith in what? Because faith is not just a thing that you have, like I've got some faith at the moment. Faith for what? Faith in who? In the promises of what God has said, particularly he'll do. And he has it. I mean, as you start to gather them and notice them, and maybe you want to start just noting them in your notes on your phone or on a piece of paper as you notice them over the next few weeks, there's a place to stand. Paul says in Romans chapter 8 that he's not worried about being separated from God because he's got God's love. Sorry, I've said that in a clear way. He says he doesn't fear anything else. Nothing can separate him from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. He says famines, he actually names famines can't separate me from the love of God that I've got that's in Christ Jesus. Angels and demons, they can't separate me from the love of God that I have in Christ Jesus. He knew the promise that Jesus now ministers to him and lives in him by his Holy Spirit, and therefore nothing can separate him from the love of God. But there's a whole bunch of promises that we ought to take hold of and not have just a vague sense that God is going to do good to me. We do believe that God has a whole mountain of goodness for you, and he's leading you there, and you'll sense it and you'll feel it and you'll have some of it on the way. But it's not a general sense that I'm going to get the best job that's out there in my industry and I'm going to go the furthest. Although I know some of you will, because we're in Bondi and that's just kind of the people that end up here for whatever interesting reason. Let's talk about that over here. You might, but I don't believe that's what God has promised. And I'm not going to speak, and I'm going to encourage you to do that and try and be that, but that's not the main thing I'm going to encourage you to walk by faith in the actual promises God has made for you in Jesus, and hold on to them as you go. And not only walk by faith, but not sin as you go. Because you'll have opportunities to be the best or to get this or to do that. And there's going to be times when that's within the realm of what God has laid in front of you. And there's going to be other times when he says, that's not for you. That's not the way. We don't do it like that in my family. God's family, we don't do it like that. And that too is a moment for faith that, oh gosh, I really want that. And I need that kind of acceptance that I would get if I had that. Or the kind of comfort and pleasure that I would get if I could have that. But he said it's not for me. And he said he's got acceptance for me in Jesus. And he's got comfort for me in Jesus. And so I'm able to say no. That's what I wish Abraham could have done in that. That's what I want for us to be able to do, to see what God is calling us to, and to get there by faith and not just by fear and sight. Well, look what happens. Abraham isn't able to control the situation because God is in control. Verse 17, but the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abraham's wife, Sarah. It just starts the end of this episode. Pharaoh's going to send them off in a moment because God's judged what's happened, that he's ended up with someone else's wife. And I just wonder, actually, if this is a reminder that God is faithful to his promises, that he will do what he said he will do. Because just in Genesis, at the start of Genesis 12, that we saw last week, God said, I will curse those who curse you. Now, Pharaoh hasn't cursed him on purpose, but Pharaoh does have Abraham's wife. And I wonder if this is actually partly a picture to Pharaoh to give this woman back. but also a picture to Abraham. I'm the God who does the things that I said, and here I am cursing those who ended up with it. And it pushes Abraham and Sarah on board. Verse 18. So Pharaoh summoned Abraham. What have you done to me? He said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. I was reading in the commentary that in Hebrew, there's just 4 words there. Your wife, take, go. 4. It's very kind of just staccato, go, out. This is really bad for me. And then chapter 13, verse 1 says, so Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. And Abraham had become very wealthy in livestock and silver and gold. It's just this strange end to the story that what started with a famine, what had just moral failure from Abraham, ends with Abraham blessed, and he's a little greater and has a kind of, he's got a bit of wealth and he's going to be okay now. Not by his own credit, by any means, but by God's faithfulness to work out what he said he was going to do with this people. And this afternoon, I really want you to consider those ways that you're tempted to sin. Those kind of patterns, the things that you go to. And I want you to think about what is the fear that is behind them? What is the distrust of God that's going on there? And just see it and decide to walk by faith instead. That God can provide for you all the things that you need. Taking you somewhere. I also want you to consider Jesus. The Hebrews chapter 12 says, endured the cross. That was his call. Now, you and I have a call to the cross as well, to our own cross. Remember, Jesus says, if anyone wants to follow me, they've got to deny themselves, take up their cross. So if anyone wants to be my disciple, then take up their cross and follow me. If you want to save your life, you'll lose it. But if you lose your life, you'll save it. So we've all got crosses, but Jesus had a very particular cross, a real one, not just metaphorically, as real as those are. But he had a timber one that would actually kill him. And the call of God on his life was to go there and to endure it, even to death. Abraham should have known that there was no way that his life was going to be taken from him, from Pharaoh, because God had stuff to do with his life, to make a great nation. But the call on Jesus' life meant he went even to death, his actual real death, trusting that God can do what he says he will do. He will bring life to me, Jesus. And he did. He was resurrected. And so I want you to consider Jesus. Hebrews 12 says, for the joy that was set before him, the mountain of joy of having you in his family, endure the cross. And as you consider the things in front of you this week, the pharaohs you've got to go into their offices or deal with them in terms of real estate and strata. So sorry if you're dealing with strata issues. As a minister, that's a common theme that people tell me about strata. This person on my strata board. But we've all got challenges, don't we? Some of them are big strata, some of them are small. And you know, there's always things that cause fear in our life. And as you face those various fears, I want to tell you to consider Jesus, because he thought of the joy that was set before him, and he was able to follow God, his Father, even into death. I want to finish with an illustration, just to leave you with an illustration to think about the idea of struggling against our fears. I have one of my joys, one of the many joys, because I get to, I've just started coaching nippers with kids on Thursday evenings. And there was very strong rips on Thursday afternoon in that first session. And so we just played and ran in and out on the sandbank. And I taught them about rips, and you all know rips because you're Bondi. We know what to do with a rip, but I taught them you don't swim in, don't try and swim in against the current, because it is stronger than you. Try and swim across. You might be strong enough just to swim across the current and onto the bank in safety, but sometimes you can't even do that. And so we know what we do. We don't struggle because you get tired and you freak out. Actually, I had to pick up a girl on my board the week before was crying because she was so scared and she'd tire herself out trying to swim against the reef. She was a lifesaver, but she'd forgotten the lifesaving. And she was actually tearing, and I thought she was waving. I waved at my board, and then she kept on waving, and I saw she was not smiling. She was crying, so I had to go pull her on the board. And the thing is, you in a rip, you just float and relax, and you wave to someone, and you ask for help, and they'll pull you out. Especially in Bondi, there's a lot of lifeguards around. And I'm giving you this because it strikes me that some of us are going to be caught in fearful places where we're tempted to take things into our own power, maybe either crumble or take things into our power and choose sin to sort things out. And I think it's like swimming against a current. It actually won't get you very far. It's not safe. What we need to do is we need to rest and wait and put up our hand, which is faith. Say, God, I need you to do what you said you would do. And I know what you said you'd do because I need to know. Otherwise, I'll just flail around doing whatever. And so I know what you told me you're going to do, and I hold on to that. Come and help me now. And I want to be real upfront with you. It probably won't this week. For Jesus, that took him to real death. But he knew that he wasn't to lie to get himself out of it. He wasn't to deceive or hurt people to get himself out of that with sin. There's a time to sit and ask God for help, which is to live by faith. And the really big things stand in this. So consider Christ and live by faith.